On this week's 51%, what does Kamala Harris's loss mean for future women candidates? We speak with Erin Loos Cutraro, founder of She Should Run, about why more women should step into the political arena.
We have this huge hole in perspective and policymaking, and the result of that is that we don't have policies that represent the full population.
We also learn about the feminist movement 4B in South Korea and whether it could gain traction in the U.S. I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessie King. Last week, we debriefed the election results with political analyst Ange-Marie Hancock, and she said something that kind of stuck with me. Essentially, she described Vice President Kamala Harris's run as a nearly impossible task, one that should not discourage political parties from backing women candidates in the future. I think there is a fear for some people that America is just not ready for a woman president, at least when the other potential candidate is Donald Trump. But our main guest today agrees that Harris's loss should not deter women from politics. In fact, she says we should be running even more women candidates. Erin Loos Cutraro is the founder and CEO of She Should Run, a nonprofit encouraging women to run for office regardless of their political party. While Harris made history as the first Black and South Asian woman to lead a major party ticket, Cutraro says there was an overall decrease in women candidates this year.
We had actually seen, following the 2016 election, quite a surge in numbers, and the following cycles from 2016, seeing a lot of headlines of, across all levels of office, there being a record number of women candidates. And I would say over the last election cycle or two, we started to see that slow, and we're finding it more challenging, I think, as a wider movement to push beyond the previous record set. And as we moved into the 2024 election, many of the great entities that track the overall numbers were reporting that the overall number of women candidates on the ballot were actually in decline. And we saw this to be especially true for Republican women, something that put us in the position to expect to see results that, were mixed. And that is actually where we landed. So, results in some races and many races actually are still being tallied, but overall, it looks like we are at risk of going backwards in terms of overall representation, or at least very much stalling.
Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking at it from She Should Run's vantage point, we have some really compelling data. As we moved into this election cycle, we were tracking very closely something that we knew to be true anecdotally in women who were or were not coming into She Should Run's programs, which are very much focused on the starting line. And that is the overall case making, the work that we do to make the case for women to run for office was getting much harder, and numbers were slowing. What we saw in our research is that lots of women were pointing to the toxic nature of politics, specifically political news, how it felt like it was nonstop and often negative. A nuance in that, though, was something that gave me hope and continues to give me hope, is that even as women cite that, the overall environment is toxic and perhaps they're pulling away, they're still showing up in their communities around issues that they care about. So it's a complicated story to tell. One that says, most definitely, I think we can look at the overall toxic nature of politics, the overall polarization in politics, as one of the many reasons that women are citing a disinterest in political leadership, and that most certainly is affecting the number of women on the ballot. I think also it is worth noting, though, that many of the barriers that have been brought to attention cycle after cycle over decades remain true today, which is, women are still not encouraged and recruited at the same rate as men. That reality is further challenged because women can't be what they can't see. So as we continue to have male, an overall story of domination of men in politics, in a system that was built for and by them, history continues to repeat itself, and that it's much, much harder to get women to step up to the table. And when they do, they're faced with a reality of not having the same networks to tap into for overall support. And that can feel very daunting. And, a reality too of now not just threats of violence that women have always had when they step into roles of leadership. Now it's happening in the virtual space on social media platforms, and it's especially difficult for women of color. So, many of the barriers that have always been in place remain in place today, and now we have an additional layer of polarization and overall, toxic nature of political news, making it difficult to make the case for women to step in.
I'd like to talk a little bit about why this is important, because as you mentioned, first of all, women can't be what they can't see. But aside from that, why should we want more women in Congress, in legislatures, and at the decision-making table?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is where I think it's so important to note that women are not monolithic. We come to the table with varied voices and perspectives. And in fact, that does make the case for why we need more women in elected offices, because we cannot expect in this country to have the smartest policies and solutions if we're, leaving more than half of the talent pool on the sidelines. As we think about that more granularly and the policies that are affecting our everyday lives, we all stand, not just women, we all as a society stand to benefit from varied perspectives in these policymaking rooms. So, we are far from that today. We're looking at and being stalled at this less than 30% of elected offices up and down, the level being represented by women. And that means that we have this huge hole in perspective and policy making, and the result of that is that we don't have policies that represent the full population.
If you've ever wondered about politics or, just even had that thought of potentially running for office, how do you know whether it's a good idea for you? How do you know whether you're the person to throw their hat in the ring or what makes a good candidate?
We have a saying at She Should Run: if you care, you're qualified. And we stand by that because, too often women are questioning whether or not that fire that they feel in their belly is enough for them to explore elected leadership. And let's start in a place of leveling a playing field and saying that men don't have that same feeling. They are not questioning their ability, and they're putting themselves out there and in a way that women are hesitating to do, and in a way that our system is not supporting women to do. I would say, you have enough to explore political leadership when you care to explore political leadership. You have to start somewhere. And that is what She Should Run is all about. Look, we don't play a role at all in helping women get across the finish line. We're there for the starting line. We're there for women who aren't certain yet, but just have that. It's probably not even a fire yet, that spark in their belly that perhaps they need to do something more in their communities. Perhaps they have a voice that is not represented in policymaking rooms. And where would that even begin? And for us, it's why our programs are fully accessible to anyone at any time, mostly in the virtual space, to just take that moment and look at what are the opportunities that are out there. There are over 500,000 elected offices in this country making policy on issues that matter to many of us, and finding your place in that is important. Knowing that you should have a place in that is important. And so the exploration really starts from getting really centered in, what it is you care about and how that can show, connecting the dots to how that can show up in policymaking. That's what She Should Run's all about.
If you've decided to run, if you're like, okay, I'm doing this, I'm going to run, what are some of those first steps you have to take to get on the ballot, to formally start the process?
Yeah, great question. Long before you're on the ballot, you have to be really clear on what you care about. You don't have to have all the answers. No elected official has all the answers. Being really clear on what you care about will drive your ability to navigate what most certainly won't be easy, steps ahead, but will be much easier when you're clear that it's worth it. It's worth your time to bring your perspective to the table. So it's about getting involved in getting connected with what you care about, then getting more involved in your community, showing up to, especially if you're looking at local offices, you don't start on the ballot, you start by showing up for the community conversations, getting a really good sense of what your community cares about and how you can be a person who can help be a voice for others. You show up to community meetings. Democracy is not something that starts and stops with an election. Most definitely, it is something that we need to invest in the day to day, and that requires a willingness to put some muscle in the game, and that game is every day. And so understanding what matters to your community, showing up for your community, getting invested in the issues that matter most to you will lend themselves to a path to political leadership. And the how-to part is well researched, and there's so many incredible organizations that can help with the how to run a campaign, how to win enough votes, and women can figure that out. They can navigate that. But I would say, the starting line doesn't look like something we're really used to talking about. It looks at that inward look at what you care about, and then that connection with your community, with what your hopeful future constituents would look like is the right place to start.
Well, Erin, thanks so much for taking the time. Before we go, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the previous election. What has been your biggest takeaway so far?
Yeah, look, I think, a couple things are true right now. We know that meaningful change isn't linear. It's slow, it's uneven, it's complicated. And this is especially true when women don't speak with one voice. And I think my reflection from this election is really an important call for us to collectively, as women, listen and, take time to listen to one another, to determine how we can, because it is essential that we do find unification, a unified reason to move forward and fight for representation. It's so critically important for the health of, our country, for the world, for future generations. And I know it's there, and I know it feels hard. It feels so hard right now, especially for those of us who, work in this field day in and day out. But the work is worth it, and change will come. And I know some are feeling really hurt right now. Many are feeling really hurt right now. But that doesn't make the work less worth it. So as women are looking at this election and thinking about the role they play in the aftermath, I think the big call here is that we all use this as a moment to lean into our own political voices and power. That sort of spark that some may be feeling more than others. We're certainly seeing it a lot with a lot of women at She Should Run, huge increases in engagement with women seeking those starting line resources. Since the election, She Should Run has seen nearly a 750% increase in women taking their first steps towards elected office. And
Wow.
That spark is what turns into future candidacies, and we need more women doing it. We need to encourage more women to lean into that feeling now, however messy it may feel. It's not going to happen overnight, and that's okay.
Erin Loos Cutraro is the founder and CEO of She Should Run, a nonprofit encouraging women of all parties to run for office. You can learn more about their programs and resources at sheshouldrun.org. Erin, thanks again.
Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it.
In the days after the election, there's been a surge in Google searches and discourse around a fringe feminist movement from South Korea. The 4B movement is a radical movement in which straight women swear off sex, dating, marriage, and childbearing with men as a form of protest. Basically, they cut out heterosexual relationships from their lives altogether. The effort started in South Korea in the late 2010s, around the time of the global Me Too movement, but it was also meant to protest specific policies in South Korea, as well as issues like femicide and revenge porn. Now that Donald Trump, a man who has been found liable for sexual abuse and whose Supreme Court picks helped overturn Roe v. Wade, is set to return as president, some liberal women on TikTok and Instagram have brought the 4B conversation to the U.S. So just how popular is 4B, and could it ever really gain traction here at home? Our main guest today is a sociology researcher at Yale University whose studies have looked at this very movement. Meera Choi studies how shifting gender dynamics in politics impact families in countries with low fertility rates, like South Korea, which has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world.
So B in Korean word represents no. So basically this movement is saying no to 4 things. One is sex with men. Second is dating with men, marriage with men, and also childbearing with men. So it's basically refusing and opting out of heterosexual relationship as a form of feminist activism to fight against violence and patriarchy and misogyny that has been prevalent in South Korean context. It's a more of an online-based popular feminist movement. So prior to this 4B movement, there has already been a surge of popular feminism among young adults after 2016, when there was a murder case that women claim as femicide in a public restroom in a very highly populated area called Gangnam Station. So since then, there was a huge shift in women turning feminist and, acknowledging these violence and just misogyny that is prevalent in women's everyday lives. And with that kind of wave and continuous trend of feminism, this 4B movement came to rise around 2018.
So how big is this movement in South Korea? Are people actually, following through with it?
Yeah, so there's no specific nationally representative survey data that exists on how many people are participating in it. But there are surveys that show that more than 2/3 of women are aware of 4B movement. And by this point, I think there are way more people who are aware of this movement. And 4B movement is, among other feminist movement, a more radical stance because it's completely opting out of heterosexual relationship as a form of protest against patriarchy. So I would say it's more of a niche movement. But what I find in my research that bases on a large scale interview with feminist women across different kind of feminist identities, what I find is that regardless of whether they call themselves I'm a 4B woman or not, there's a general sentiment around, refusing heterosexual relationship as a form of alternative lifestyle, and also almost seen as a desirable way of living because of the shared idea that women are not safe in relationship with men, and the South Korean society that is very much patriarchal and misogynistic, with the current conservative right-wing politician ruling the country. The government and the country is not protecting women and actually are anti-feminist. So based on that kind of general consensus and sentiment, there's a wide range of agreement that refusing heterosexual relationship is a good thing.
And how has this movement played out so far in South Korea since 2018?
Right. I think there has been different waves of backlash, especially because of the way feminism is kind of demonized in Korean context, more so after the presidential election in 2022. So the president explicitly commented that feminism is the deterrence to healthy relationship between men and women. And, he also declared that he believes that structural sexism in Korea does not exist anymore. So he also promised to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family for that reason. So there has been a lot of pushback and a lot of right-wing conservative politicians that really cater to conservative young men using the language of demonizing and kind of retaliating feminism to gain their political vote. So in that sense, I think 4B movement and a lot of radical feminists have been target of attacks in a lot of misogynistic communities and stuff like that. But I think there has been continuous movement and just in general, more and more women becoming feminist and feminism becoming a part of popular narratives among young women that, more and more women are kind of protesting against South Korean government's approach to solving low fertility because there has just been constant removal and erasure of women's voices and dismissing how gender inequality and structural sexism is part of the reason why women are not engaging in heterosexual relationships. Eventually, I hope that there is a more of a recognition of these women's voices. But as of now, I think on the level of like politics, there's still much more backlash and denial of feminist movement.
Okay, so now the big question, I guess, discourse around the 4B movement has increased on social media here at home. Do you think this could actually gain traction in the US, or is the environment just too different here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest motivating factor in the US for 4B movement to be introduced and to kind of become popularized was this like consecutive events of like the Roe v. Wade overturn and then Trump being reelected. There's just many moments in the politics showing how women's rights are not prioritized or even, denied. And I think that was a big motivating factor for the 4B movement to be introduced and has become some kind of alternative way of approaching feminist activism in the US. But regards to the question of whether 4B movement will settle in the US, I think it's still unclear and we would have to see how it unfolds. But I think one other factor that is different in the US is that, it's after the Trump being reelected, I think a lot of the discussions even around 4B movement is very much on like the conservative and liberal divide. And I've been already seeing so much of backlash from the conservative party around just like mocking how liberal women are deciding to opt out of heterosexual relationship, which is kind of in their terms catering to conservative feature because liberal women are not giving birth. I've been seeing so much of these backlash already. And I think one other factor is that it also depends on how this discussion unfolds in the future. But misogyny and gender inequality, it's much more than just individual relationship with men. And I think this is a good starting point where it really, what I find also in my research is that women who decide to refuse heterosexual relationship and take a break from prioritizing their life around heterosexuality, it gives them a lot of opportunity to think of alternative way of living and caring, just rearranging their future outside of relationship with men. That really gives a lot of empowerment and autonomy for women. But I think just in general, refusing and opting out of heterosexual relationship as a form of protest, there's just so much room for backlash and criticisms. So I'm not sure how it would settle down in the US. And one other kind of cultural difference that I find is that I think in the US, there's much more virtue and values as feminists too around choice and freedom. And I think choice and freedom in the US is very much of a cherished moral value and also a feminist value. So this kind of idea that, you have to refuse heterosexual relationship to fight against patriarchy, I think there could be some, pushback and attack like around how it could also limit women's choice around other ways of living, including, being engaged in heterosexual relationship. So I'm not sure how the 4B movement could unfold in the US given these cultural differences.
I think it's worth pointing out that, a lot of women did vote for Trump too, and there are women who disagree with abortion. So as our previous guest said earlier on in the show, women are not a monolith. So it's not as if women are necessarily unified on these issues. You've kind of touched on it already, but how else might the broader feminist movements in South Korea and the US differ from one another?
Yeah, I think there are some shared feminist values and ideas and movements, given how the Me Too movement was a transnational movement that, happened pretty much concurrently in the US, in Korea, and in any other countries. So there's the perception around gender-based violence and sexual violence, and just the debunking of rape culture and how heteronormative dating scripts and sexual scripts have been very discriminatory and unequal to women. I think that kind of notion being debunked and being shared by feminist women, I think, is something that we share in Korean context and also in the US. But as I said earlier, I think in the US, there's much more discussions around choice and freedom, whereas in Korea, there's much more discussions around what is a good feminism, what is the right way to practice feminism, coming from a more homogenous, perception of feminism and also of society. Whereas I think in the US, there's much more already prior to this kind of 4B movement and this new wave of feminist movement, there has been a long discussion around LGBTQ and other sexual minorities and gender minorities as well. So I think there's much more kind of discussion around who can be a part of this movement, who should be a part of this movement. How can we think of this 4B movement beyond this gender binary heterosexual relationship? I'm not sure if that's actually happening at the popular narrative and discourse level yet, but I think there's a different ground in terms of how the LGBTQ rights are very much tied to women's rights, and there are different, axes of inequalities and minority status that should be, a part of feminist movement. So in that sense, I think there's some differences, but in general, the reality of women being faced with these kinds of misogyny and anti-feminist policies, there's just so much commonality that's being shared across different contexts.
Meera Choi is a sociology PhD candidate at Yale University, researching how shifting politics and gender dynamics are impacting families and relationships in South Korea. You can learn more about her work at sociology.yale.edu. You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio, based in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Madeleine Reynolds, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at our website, wamcpodcast.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at wamc.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night and down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my